Hey guys! Welcome back to another long, sleepy journey through the weird corridors of history. Go ahead, dim the lights, tuck yourself in, maybe grab a cup of tea you'll forget to drink halfway through, because tonight we're talking about one of history's most quietly disastrous professions, the royal physician. You know, the men who were trusted with the health of emperors, queens, and kings, but often managed to kill them faster than plague, poison, or bad politics ever could. Not on purpose, of course, usually. This is a story about the doctors who lived in castles, treated kings with mercury, prescribed arsenic for headaches, and confidently declared that bleeding a little more would surely fix everything. And somehow, these people had job security. So let's start with one of the earliest and most infamous examples, the court physicians of the late medieval and early modern world, the guys who had more power over monarchs than some generals or priests, and yet often couldn't tell the difference between a fever and divine punishment. Let's float back to the 16th century, when medicine was more art than science, and mostly art in the sense of finger painting. The age of leeches and latrines. Back in the Tudor and Habsburg courts, medicine was a strange mix of astrology, humors, and pure guesswork. Royal doctors were often chosen not because they were competent, but because they were well-connected, charming, or good at flattery. You didn't need to cure anyone, you just had to sound confident while doing it. If you could sprinkle in a few Latin phrases and maybe reference Aristotle while suggesting that the king's migraines were caused by excess melancholy, congratulations, you were hired. And so, predictably, most royal medical care was one long series of slow-motion disasters. Let's begin with one of the most famous medical mishaps in royal history. King Charles II of England, also known as the Merry Monarch, because he liked wine, women, and pretending he wasn't dying. Charles II and the 14 different ways to die at once. In February 1685, Charles II suffered what was likely a simple stroke, a minor one at first. He had a seizure while shaving, yes, while shaving, and collapsed. His doctors, rushing to help, decided that the best thing to do was everything. And by everything, I mean every single possible medical treatment known to the 17th century, all in the span of a few days. They bled him, over 1.5 pints of blood gone within hours. They purged him. They gave him emetics, that's fancy for make him throw up repeatedly. They shoved enemas into him daily, sometimes twice. They applied blistering agents to his head to draw out the evil vapors. They made him drink mixtures of herbs, alcohol, and powdered human skull, because apparently, why not? One doctor even suggested applying pigeon carcasses to his feet, which they actually did. The royal diary described it almost casually. Quote, "His Majesty endured the application of pigeons with remarkable patience." By the end of the week, Charles was so weak from treatment that even the plague might have felt sorry for him. He reportedly told his courtiers, with his last bits of wit, quote, "I am sorry, gentlemen, for being such a long time dying." It wasn't the stroke that killed him, it was the sheer enthusiasm of 14 doctors armed with medieval optimism. The age of leeches and latrines. Back in the Tudor and Habsburg courts, medicine was a strange mix of astrology, humors, and pure guesswork. Royal doctors were often chosen not because they were competent, but because they were well-connected, charming, or good at flattery. You didn't need to cure anyone, you just had to sound confident while doing it. If you could sprinkle in a few Latin phrases and maybe reference Aristotle while suggesting that the king's migraines were caused by excess melancholy, congratulations, you were hired. And so, predictably, most royal medical care was one long series of slow-motion disasters. Let's begin with one of the most famous medical mishaps in royal history. King Charles II of England, also known as the Merry Monarch, because he liked wine, women, and pretending he wasn't dying. Charles II and the 14 different ways to die at once. In February 1685, Charles II suffered what was likely a simple stroke, a minor one at first. He had a seizure while shaving, yes, while shaving, and collapsed. His doctors, rushing to help, decided that the best thing to do was everything. And by everything, I mean every single possible medical treatment known to the 17th century, all in the span of a few days. They bled him, over 1.5 pints of blood gone within hours. They purged him. They gave him emetics, that's fancy for make him throw up repeatedly. They shoved enemas into him daily, sometimes twice. They applied blistering agents to his head to draw out the evil vapors. They made him drink mixtures of herbs, alcohol, and powdered human skull, because apparently, why not? One doctor even suggested applying pigeon carcasses to his feet, which they actually did. The royal diary described it almost casually. Quote, "His Majesty endured the application of pigeons with remarkable patience." By the end of the week, Charles was so weak from treatment that even the plague might have felt sorry for him. He reportedly told his courtiers, with his last bits of wit, quote, "I am sorry, gentlemen, for being such a long time dying." It wasn't the stroke that killed him. It was the sheer enthusiasm of 14 doctors armed with medieval optimism. The age of leeches and latrines. Back in the Tudor and Habsburg courts, medicine was a strange mix of astrology, humors, and pure guesswork. Royal doctors were often chosen not because they were competent, but because they were well-connected, charming, or good at flattery. You didn't need to cure anyone, you just had to sound confident while doing it. If you could sprinkle in a few Latin phrases and maybe reference Aristotle while suggesting that the king's migraines were caused by excess melancholy, congratulations, you were hired. And so, predictably, most royal medical care was one long series of slow-motion disasters. Let's begin with one of the most famous medical mishaps in royal history. King Charles II of England, also known as the Merry Monarch, because he liked wine, women, and pretending he wasn't dying. Charles II and the 14 different ways to die at once. In February 1685, Charles II suffered what was likely a simple stroke, a minor one at first. He had a seizure while shaving, yes, while shaving, and collapsed. His doctors, rushing to help, decided that the best thing to do was everything. And by everything, I mean every single possible medical treatment known to the 17th century, all in the span of a few days. They bled him, over 1.5 pints of blood gone within hours. They purged him. They gave him emetics, that's fancy for make him throw up repeatedly. They shoved enemas into him daily, sometimes twice. They applied blistering agents to his head to draw out the evil vapors. They made him drink mixtures of herbs, alcohol, and powdered human skull, because apparently, why not? One doctor even suggested applying pigeon carcasses to his feet, which they actually did. The royal diary described it almost casually. Quote, "His Majesty endured the application of pigeons with remarkable patience." By the end of the week, Charles was so weak from treatment that even the plague might have felt sorry for him. He reportedly told his courtiers, with his last bits of wit, quote, "I am sorry, gentlemen, for being such a long time dying." It wasn't the stroke that killed him. It was the sheer enthusiasm of 14 doctors armed with medieval optimism. The age of leeches and latrines. Back in the Tudor and Habsburg courts, medicine was a strange mix of astrology, humorous, and pure guesswork. Royal doctors were often chosen not because they were competent, but because they were well-connected, charming, or good at flattery. You didn't need to cure anyone, you just had to sound confident while doing it. If you could sprinkle in a few Latin phrases and maybe reference Aristotle while suggesting that the king's migraines were caused by excess melancholy, congratulations, you were hired. And so, predictably, most royal medical care was one long series of slow-motion disasters. Let's begin with one of the most famous medical mishaps in royal history. King Charles II of England, also known as the Merry Monarch, because he liked wine, women, and pretending he won. Though he also had a bad time. Spanish Charles was the end product of centuries of royal inbreeding, a man so physically and mentally unwell that even his contemporaries described him as more a corpse than a king. He could barely chew his food, couldn't walk without help, and his doctors genuinely thought he was cursed. And honestly, can you blame them? When Charles died at just 38, an autopsy revealed he had the heart of a man in his 90s, a single shriveled testicle, and a head full of fluid. That's not even a joke. That's the medical report. But here's the thing. His doctors didn't just fail to help him, they made it worse. They regularly bled him, starved him, and forced them to ingest tonics made from ground-up herbs, metals, and, occasionally, bits of animal parts. They even tried exorcisms, just in case the devil was behind his infertility. So, yes, while genetics dealt the blow, medicine enthusiastically swung the hammer. Royal cures, modern poisons. If you're wondering why so many of these doctors thought poisoning their patients with mercury was fine, it's because everyone believed sickness came from imbalance, not germs. You didn't catch a disease. You were just too hot, or too cold, or maybe had too much bile. So naturally, the solution was to throw your entire body chemistry into chaos and see what happened. Mercury was used for treating syphilis, ulcers, melancholy, basically everything except mercury poisoning itself. Catherine the Great's doctors in Russia prescribed it liberally, and some of her courtiers went bald, blind, or just dead. Even more ironic, royal doctors often died before their royal patients did. You'd think that'd be a clue, but no. The next generation simply called it unfortunate coincidence and carried on. The Barber Surgeon Chronicles. And not every doctor was a doctor. Many were barber surgeons. Yes, the same people who cut your hair could also amputate your leg or drill into your skull. Barber poles, the red stripes, originally represented blood, the white, bandages. So next time you pass one, remember, it's basically an ad for medieval trauma. Royal barbers often doubled as surgeons because they were the only ones allowed to hold sharp instruments near a nobleman. Their qualifications? Steady hands, sharp knives, and a strong stomach. In the court of Henry VIII, barber surgeons handled everything from toothaches to battlefield wounds. And considering how often Henry was bleeding from somewhere, either his leg ulcers or his temper, they were busy men. Henry's doctors tried everything to heal his ulcerated leg, including draining it daily, cauterizing it, and applying poultices made of honey, vinegar, and, tragically, cow dung. The king's smell became legendary. Courtiers reported that you could smell him before you saw him. His doctors, of course, said he was improving, because you don't tell a king he smells like a dying cow and live to collect your paycheck. The rise of the enlightened but still wrong doctors. By the 18th century, modern medicine started creeping in. And by modern, I mean marginally less homicidal. Royal physicians were now reading books, using microscopes, and washing their hands occasionally. But even then, mistakes continued at a majestic pace. Take George III of England, the Mad King himself. His doctors diagnosed him with everything from porphyria to melancholic hysteria to being possessed by the devil. Their solution? Bleed him again and restrain him for days at a time. He was sometimes tied to a chair and screamed at by attendants in the name of treatment. Later analysis suggests he probably had a metabolic disorder, one that could have been managed if his doctors hadn't been so enthusiastic with the scissors and sedatives. But they meant well, probably. And that's just the beginning. We haven't even gotten to the doctors who mixed potions for Napoleon, poisoned czars with their own tonics, or experimented on queens who just wanted to stop fainting. But that's for the next stretch of our long, sleepy voyage through royal malpractice. So, take a breath, adjust your blanket, and when you're ready, we'll drift further into the story of the royal doctor who outlived and outkilled most of his own patients. Welcome back, friends. If you're still awake, congratulations! You've already survived one royal autopsy and about 4 pints of 17th century bloodletting. Let's loosen the blankets and drift a little further down the candlelit corridors of Versailles, where perfume covered everything except common sense. Tonight's subject, Dr. Antoine d'Aquin, royal physician to the Sun King, Louis XIV. A man so ambitious, so polished, and so catastrophically overconfident that he somehow managed to turn medicine into palace politics, and, in the process, accidentally poison half the French court. Because of course he did. Enter the Golden Quack. Antoine d'Aquin was born into privilege, which already qualified him for royal employment. His family had been court doctors for generations, which in 17th century France was like inheriting a hereditary disease, only with better wigs. He studied medicine at Montpellier, one of the best universities in Europe, where he learned all the latest theories about humors, vapors, and other invisible forces that definitely didn't exist. But Antoine wasn't content to be a doctor. He wanted to be seen as a doctor, preferably by people in expensive shoes. So he cultivated the perfect Versailles persona, powdered hair, lace cuffs, and a vocabulary made entirely of Latin and flattery. When Louis XIV began to suffer from what polite historians call digestive distress, and what less polite ones call royal constipation, d'Aquin saw his chance. The king who glowed too brightly. Louis was, by this point, around 50. His glory days of endless banquets and dancing had caught up with him. He was bloated, sweaty, and perpetually uncomfortable, the kind of man whose stomach probably made polite gurgling noises during council meetings. Antoine d'Aquin examined the king and, after much dramatic pondering, declared that the royal humors were in rebellion. His solution? Purge everything. So he prescribed the usual cocktail of laxatives, emetics, and, because why not, mercury pills. Mercury at the time was considered a miracle ingredient. It cleansed the system. It also happened to destroy internal organs, but details. For weeks, the king was violently ill. He alternated between sweating, vomiting, and being so dizzy he could barely stand. But when he briefly felt better, purely by coincidence, d'Aquin claimed victory. And just like that, he became Premier Médecin du Roi, the chief physician to the most powerful monarch in Europe. Power, perfume, and poison. Now, being the king's doctor came with more than money. It came with access. Antoine could whisper in Louis's ear, literally and politically. He dined at court, attended secret councils, and decided who got to touch the royal body, which in Versailles terms was practically divine real estate. And of course, he used that access like any sensible man in a snake pit of nobles to advance his family. Within months, the Deccan clan occupied half the medical posts in France. His brothers became bishops, his cousins collected pensions, even his barber got a promotion. Everyone loved Deccan until they didn't. Because there was one small problem. Louis XIV's health wasn't improving. In fact, it was steadily collapsing under the weight of endless cures. His stomach ulcers worsened, his skin erupted in sores, his gums bled. And yet, every time the king winced, Deccan offered another round of tonics, powders, and bleeding. When in doubt, let it out. Some historians believe he slowly poisoned the king, not intentionally, but simply through cumulative incompetence. Mercury, antimony, and arsenic were part of almost every royal prescription, the same ingredients found in rat poison. But don't worry, they were expensive rat poisons. The Great Enema Crisis of 1686. The breaking point came with what courtiers politely called the abscess affair. One day, Louis developed a painful swelling on his backside, possibly a fistula, possibly karma. Whatever it was, it made sitting on his throne complicated. Deccan prescribed poultices, ointments, and, inevitably, enemas. So many enemas that the royal valet started keeping count. When those didn't work, Deccan brought in surgeons to lance the abscess several times. The king screamed through each session. The courtiers prayed. Deccan beamed proudly. When the wound refused to heal, the doctor doubled down. Clearly, the king just needed more treatment. By now, everyone in Versailles could smell infection from the hallway. The court chaplain began performing daily blessings near the royal bedchamber, just in case divine intervention worked faster than Deccan's ointments. Finally, another surgeon, Charles-François Felix, stepped in, horrified. He spent months quietly practicing surgery on prisoners to perfect a delicate procedure, then successfully operated on the king in 1686. Louis recovered, the court rejoiced, and Deccan was quietly sidelined. The fall of the Golden Physician. Losing royal favor at Versailles was like falling off a cliff made of silk and gossip. One day, Deccan was a star. The next, he was an embarrassment. Louis began to suspect his physician had been more interested in money than medicine, which was a fair assumption, considering Deccan's income rivaled that of small dukes. The final straw came when Antoine requested that his son be made an archbishop. The king, perhaps still sore in more ways than one, finally snapped. "The Deccans," he reportedly muttered, "think the kingdom is theirs." Within weeks, Antoine was dismissed, his family exiled from court. He retired to the countryside, wealthy but bitter, muttering about ingratitude and royal humors. He died a few years later, possibly from the same kind of medical overenthusiasm he'd inflicted on others. The legacy of a killer healer. Was Da Quinn truly a poisoner? Probably not, in the cinematic sense. He didn't pour arsenic into the royal soup. He was, instead, the embodiment of a more dangerous truth, that bad medicine, delivered with confidence, can do more harm than malice ever could. Louis XIV survived him, but barely. By his final years, the king's body was a medical battlefield, scarred, ulcerated, and stuffed with decades of cures. When he died in 1715, his autopsy revealed organs so damaged that even his doctors went pale. He was, quite literally, preserved from the inside out by mercury. Still, Antoine d'Aquin left behind a curious reputation. Some saw him as a victim of shifting fashions, a man punished for doing what all doctors of his age did. Others saw him as the perfect Versailles villain, elegant, ambitious, and fatally confident. Either way, he perfectly fits our theme. A royal doctor who managed to kill more kings and nearly a few empires than plague ever dreamed of. Let's drift onward then, because France didn't have a monopoly on deadly medicine. Across the Channel, another court was brewing its own medical catastrophe, involving a queen, a miracle potion, and the slow, sticky death of a dynasty. Settle in a little deeper. The candles are still burning low. Next, we'll meet Queen Anne's doctor, whose miracle cure turned tragedy into routine. Welcome back, weary listener. If you're still with me and not already drifting in and out like a fainting duchess, congratulations! You've survived the French Mercury era. Now, let's pull back the velvet curtain and float gently over to England once again, where wigs were taller, gowns were heavier, and the royal womb was a matter of national security. Tonight's tragic medical lullaby belongs to Queen Anne of Great Britain and the doctors who treated her like a very determined science experiment. She was the last of the Stuarts, a dynasty famous for civil wars, religious feuds, and a general inability to stay healthy. Anne's reign was marked by political turmoil, gout, and the slow-motion heartbreak of 17 pregnancies that ended in 17 losses. 17. And through it all stood her doctors, confident as ever, ready to bleed, purge, and balance her health into oblivion. A delicate constitution and even delicater medicine. Anne was born in 1665, the daughter of James, Duke of York, the future James II, and Anne Hyde, who was both her mother and her first cautionary medical tale. Anne Hyde died young, ravaged by disease and over-treatment. Her daughter inherited both her mother's fragile health and her doctor's eternal enthusiasm. From early childhood, Anne suffered from constant eye infections. The court physicians treated this, naturally, with lead-based ointments. Because if something burns your eyes, surely it's working. By her teens, she was already plagued by what the doctors politely called gout. Though given her diet of rich meats and minimal exercise, it could have been anything from arthritis to chronic inflammation. When she married Prince George of Denmark, everyone cheered. Finally, an alliance that looked peaceful, profitable, and likely to produce heirs. And, in a way, it did. Anne became pregnant nearly every year for the next 2 decades. The problem was, none of the pregnancies ended happily. The royal womb under siege. Her doctors kept meticulous notes, because what's a little tragedy without documentation? Out of those 17 pregnancies, 12 ended in miscarriage or stillbirth. Of the 5 children born alive, 4 died within hours or days. Only one son, little William, Duke of Gloucester, survived past infancy. He was sickly, pale, and kept alive by sheer royal willpower. Anne adored him. He was her entire world, and naturally, her doctor's favorite laboratory subject. They bled him for fevers, they purged him for colds, they dosed him with laudanum when he couldn't sleep. He died at age 11. Some sources say from smallpox, others from hydrocephalus, but most likely it was the cumulative result of too much medicine and not enough mercy. After that, Anne's health broke completely. Treatment fit for a queen. The Queen's doctors, led by the celebrated Sir John Radcliffe and his successor Dr. Hans Sloane, yes, the same Sloane who later founded the British Museum, prescribed the usual horrors. Anne was bled frequently, sometimes several times a month. She was given mercury pills for stiffness and imbalance. For swelling in her legs, they wrapped her in vinegar-soaked cloths. When that failed, they prescribed the fashionable new anti-gout waters, mineral-rich potions that were, in modern terms, industrial runoff. If you're thinking that sounds bad, you're right. But wait, it gets worse. As Anne's weight increased, partially from steroids and opiates, though no one called them that yet, her doctors became convinced she was suffering from dropsy, or fluid retention. Their cure? More purging, more bleeding. She could barely walk. Her legs ulcerated, her hands swelled. At one point, she was carried to Parliament in an open chair, weeping in pain, while her physicians proudly noted that the Queen remains in good spirits. Good spirits, of course, being code for too sedated to argue. The loyal quack, Sir John Radcliffe. Now, Radcliffe was one of those doctors who could have had a great career if he'd ever learned when to stop talking. He was clever, yes, educated, certainly, but tactful? Absolutely not. When Queen Anne asked about her latest treatment, Radcliffe reportedly muttered that Her Majesty's fatness made her ailments incurable. He was promptly fired, and in the grand English tradition, immediately replaced by someone even worse. Dr. Hans Sloane stepped in, armed with enthusiasm, herbal concoctions, and what we might now call unjustified optimism. He encouraged Anne to try milk baths for her swelling, which, surprisingly, she enjoyed. Less surprisingly, they did absolutely nothing. Sloane also believed in chalybeate waters, iron-rich spa waters said to cleanse the blood. Anne drank gallons of them. They turned her teeth black. But he was charming, and he took notes in beautiful handwriting, so he remained in favor. The Tragedy of William. Meanwhile, her beloved son William was being steadily over-treated by his own set of doctors. They wrapped him in wool blankets, dosed him with mercury for fevers, and drained excess fluids whenever he sneezed. The poor child's immune system never stood a chance. When he died in 1700, Anne was inconsolable. The doctors, however, simply shifted focus from healing her body to managing her grief, which in 18th century medicine meant opium. She was prescribed laudanum daily, the fashionable cure for sadness, insomnia, gout, indigestion, and existing. Soon, Anne was not only ill, but dependent. She alternated between foggy calm and painful lucidity, never truly recovering from the loss of her son. Her body swelled, her joints stiffened, her eyesight faded, And through it all, her doctors scribbled notes, nodded sagely, and proposed yet another regimen of gentle bleeding. The Queen's body is the realm's body. There's something uniquely cruel about being a royal patient. Your body isn't really yours. It's property of the crown, the church, and the public imagination. Every miscarriage Anne suffered was dissected in political gossip. Every swelling, every fainting spell became national news. Whispers whispered that her infertility was divine punishment. Tories blamed her doctors, or worse, her enemies at court. Meanwhile, the Queen herself just kept trying. Between 1684 and 1700, she endured almost yearly pregnancies, miscarriages, and deaths, often without proper recovery time. Her doctors never questioned the cycle. They simply adapted it. Each loss was met with new tonics, new regimens, new experimental waters. And each time, she grew weaker. By her 40s, Anne could barely stand. She used a mechanical chair to move between rooms. Her legs were covered in ulcers. Her physicians described her condition as dropsy, complicated with gout and hysteria, which is 18th century code for, we have no idea what's happening. The final years, a kingdom in decline. In her last years, Anne ruled from bed. Her physicians rotated daily, adjusting doses of laudanum and brandy, the two universal medicines of the British elite. Sometimes they bled her to relieve pressure, sometimes they blistered her skin to draw off bad humors. She endured it all quietly. She was, after all, a queen. But her letters show glimpses of despair. At one point, she wrote to a friend, "I am grown a perfect carcass of misery." When she finally died in 1714, her body was so swollen that it reportedly took 14 men to carry her coffin. And yet, her doctors, ever diplomatic, insisted she had passed peacefully and under good care. Good care, indeed. The lesson that never landed. Queen Anne's story is one of the most quietly devastating in royal history, not because of betrayal or politics, though she had plenty of both, but because she was slowly undone by the same hands meant to heal her. Her doctors weren't malicious, they were simply wrong, with confidence. They bled her because that's what you did. They gave her mercury because it sparkled and sounded intelligent. They watched her fade away and called it treatment. And in the end, the woman who should have secured a dynasty left no heirs, no health, and no legacy beyond the United Kingdom itself, born in the same year her body finally gave out. So let's pause here, somewhere between pity and disbelief. Take a slow breath, maybe stretch a little. We've wandered through poisons and English purges, but our next royal patient brings us into darker territory, where medicine meets manipulation, and healing becomes a convenient disguise for power. Next up, the doctor, the Tsar, and the holy madness of Rasputin. Because, of course, the Russians had to outdo everyone. And now we travel east, far from Versailles' perfume clouds and poison cups, to the frozen palaces of St. Petersburg, where chandeliers trembled like icicles, and the air smelled faintly of wax, incense, and fear. Enter the doctor, Dr. Sergei Botkin, later followed by Dr. Eugene Botkin, and an endless parade of medical men, each believing they could tame the strange fever that haunted the Romanovs. A fever that wore a beard, a fever that smelled of prayer, vodka, and prophecy. They called him Grigory Rasputin, a Siberian peasant, part monk, part myth, part madness. He wandered into the royal family like a ghost invited to dinner, and somehow he never left. The Tsaritsa Alexandra believed him holy, for when her young son bled, Rasputin would pray, and the bleeding would stop. The doctors, of course, hated this. How dare a filthy mystic out-heal the empire's finest? They had years of training, sterile gloves, and Latin words. He had an aura. Soon whispers began to swirl, that the empress was bewitched, that the healer was a devil, that the empire's veins were filled not with blood, but with superstition and seduction. The doctors prescribed medicine. Rasputin prescribed silence, stillness, and faith. And somehow it worked more often than it should have. Science bent its knee to mysticism, and the empire shuddered. In candlelit halls, the Tsaritsa would whisper his name as if summoning salvation, while her physicians watched helplessly, men of reason reduced to background furniture in a theater of divine absurdity. They tried to warn the Tsar. They tried to write reports. But how do you medically diagnose a curse, a nation unraveling under its own holiness? And then, as all fairy tales must curdle, the holy man began to rot. Scandals multiplied, nobles plotted, even the doctors sharpened their instruments, not for healing this time, but for silence. In 1916, they poisoned him, shot him, beat him, drowned him. The man simply refused to die. It was as though the empire itself was choking on its own prophecy. And when he finally sank beneath the frozen river, so too did the Romanov dynasty. The doctor's stethoscopes, the Tsar's crown, the mystic's cross, all swept under the same black ice. So sleep now, dear listener, and dream of a time when medicine fought magic and both lost. Because in the end, it wasn't the bleeding boy or the mad monk that doomed Russia. It was the quiet war between cure and belief, and the unbearable vanity of men who thought they could save royalty from fate. And now we step into the gaslit fog of Victorian London, where the air was thick with coal dust and gossip, and every doctor fancied himself a savior, or worse, a collector. Enter Dr. Frederick Treves, elegant, educated, the very picture of late 19th century virtue, with polished boots and an unshakable belief that science was the new god. One evening, he wandered into a sideshow, that grotesque circus of the unwanted, and there he found him, Joseph Merrick, known to the crowd as the Elephant Man. His skin folded like melted wax, his bones bent like old iron under rain. He was not a man, they said, but a mistake of nature, a curiosity, a punishment. Dr. Treves looked upon him not with horror, but with fascination. That delicate Victorian kind of pity which hides its cruelty behind charity. He took Merrick from the freak show, cleaned him, educated him, displayed him once again, but this time before the polite society of London. A new exhibit for the upper class, under better lighting. The doctor claimed it was mercy. The critics whispered it was pride. And Joseph, poor Joseph, learned to bow, to thank, to smile, to play the part of gratitude. They said he found peace, but in truth he lived in a glass cage, surrounded by silver spoons and moral applause, a saint of deformity, a pet of the medical world. At night, when the visitors left, he would lie still, so still, because even sleep could kill him, his head too heavy to rest like other men's. One night he tried anyway, to sleep normally, to dream as a man, not a monster, and his neck broke. They called it a tragedy, they called it science, but some say it was his final act of rebellion, a silent, graceful refusal to live as a specimen any longer. Dr. Treves published his papers, wrote his memoirs, spoke of compassion and progress, yet behind his noble tone you can almost hear the rattle of exhibition glass, the faint echo of applause. Because beneath all the pity and philanthropy, the doctor and the freak were both trapped in the same story, one chained by his body, the other by his ego. And now, in the quiet of London's endless fog, the ghost of the whispering slowly elephant man lingers still. A soft, impossible question whispered to medicine, to morality, to mankind itself. Who was truly deformed? Tonight, let's drift back once again through that damp, gaslit tunnel of history, the one that always seems to lead back to Whitechapel. It's 1888, and London is rotting beautifully. Fog curling through narrow lanes, horses clopping over cobblestones, slick with something you hope is just rain, and an entire empire pretending that nothing bad ever happens to the poor. And somewhere in all that gloom, a doctor. Of course, there's always a doctor. This one's name was Sir William Gull, personal physician to Queen Victoria herself, a man whose brain was as sharp as his scalpels, and whose bedside manner could probably chill milk. He'd treated the royal family through their headaches, their melancholies, their endless hereditary nonsense. But after years of service, Gull retired, or at least that's what the papers said, because as the story goes, he didn't really stop working, he just started experimenting. This is where history starts to sound like fevered bedtime gossip. According to a handful of very confident conspiracy theorists, Dr. Gull wasn't done with royal secrets. He was allegedly involved in the Jack the Ripper murders. Yes, those murders. The ones that turned half of London into an anxious detective novel and the other half into meat. The theory went that Gull, ever the loyal servant of the crown, was ordered to clean up a royal scandal, something about Prince Albert Victor getting a little too friendly with a Whitechapel girl. The story was ridiculous, but also just plausible enough for Victorian imaginations. After all, it involved royalty, sex, murder, and medicine, the four great British pastimes. In this tale, Gull becomes a kind of grim avenger, a surgeon stalking the streets, snuffing out witnesses in the name of discretion, a doctor with a scalpel and divine purpose, and, perhaps worst of all, a royal appointment. Now, historically speaking, there's no real proof he ever did it. Gull was old, sick, and half paralyzed by the time of the Ripper killings. But that's never stopped a good conspiracy from making itself comfortable. And there's something almost poetic, isn't there? A royal doctor spending his twilight years haunting the same alleys that the Empire tried so hard to forget. Even without the murder myth, Dr. Gull's legacy is strange enough. He was brilliant, yes, helped identify what we now call anorexia nervosa, studied blood flow like it was a secret religion, and served one of the most powerful women in history. Yet in the end, he became a ghost story, a symbol of how the rational world of medicine can easily dissolve into nightmare and myth. The Victorians, after all, loved their irony. They built hospitals beside workhouses, prisons beside churches, and they trusted men like Gull to cure their madness with more madness. He died quietly in 1890. No fog, no knife, no scandal. Just another old man slipping away into the gray. But the legend stayed. Because nothing dies harder than a rumor that involves royalty and blood. So tonight, as we close the lamp on this final patient, we can almost imagine Sir William still there, in his long coat, walking the border between respectability and rot, a doctor of empire, a surgeon of secrets, and perhaps in some quiet corner of his own mind, the last physician of the dying Victorian soul. Let's drift away with him now, down Whitechapel's empty lanes, where the fog still remembers the sound of his cane. And the Empire, that old, beautiful, sickly empire, keeps pretending it doesn't know the diagnosis. Let's travel backward now, far from London's fog, to a much shinier kind of decay. Versailles, mid-1700s, where gold leaf covered the cracks, perfume covered the plague, and every heartbeat of the kingdom seemed to echo through a single overworked physician. His name was Dr. Francois Quesnay, personal doctor to King Louis XV, philosopher, economist, and, most importantly, the man responsible for keeping a nation's favorite pleasure addict alive. Quesnay wasn't like the usual Versailles doctors, those powdered, perfumed men who prescribed leeches and divine will in equal measure. He was calm, logical, a sort of Enlightenment upgrade to medieval guesswork. He believed the body and the kingdom both functioned like living systems, which, of course, was a poetic way of saying, your monarch is just a big set of bad arteries. They called him the philosopher-physician. He wrote essays on economics between enemas. He invented the term physiocracy, which basically meant rule of nature. In practice, that meant he thought the economy should be run like a farm, and doctors should run the state. A perfectly normal Versailles opinion. Louis XV adored him, and why not? Quesnay kept him alive through syphilis, fevers, and a number of moral diseases that would require an entire cryobiography. Pharmacy of confessionals. Whenever the king felt unwell, almost weary, too much wine, too much perfume, too much existence, he'd send for his beloved doctor. Quesnay would stroll in, quietly take the royal pulse, and announce in his slow, rational tone that His Majesty's humors were unbalanced, which was code for "you've overindulged again." Louis would nod gravely, swear to reform, and then host another midnight feast. What made Quesnay unusual was his ability to sound brilliant without actually fixing much. He diagnosed the French economy with the same detachment he used on the king's liver: correct, precise, and entirely useless in preventing collapse. He believed farmers were the heart of France, not the aristocracy. An interesting opinion for a man who lived inside a palace surrounded by diamonds and powdered sugar. Madame de Pompadour, the king's legendary mistress, adored him too. She even gave him rooms in her private suite. He spent evenings surrounded by silk and scandal, scribbling equations about soil productivity while she painted her lips in front of the mirror. It was Versailles' perfection: philosophy, flirtation, and faint decay. When Quesnay wasn't tending to the royal pulse, he was lecturing about balance, how a healthy body mirrored a healthy state. Of course, the irony is that both the king and the kingdom were terminal by then. Louis XV was aging into paranoia, the economy was wilting, and the Enlightenment had begun sharpening its guillotine. Quesnay died peacefully in 1774, just before the real fevers of revolution began. Louis XV followed him a few months later, perhaps comforted by the fact that his doctor went first, proving once and for all that medicine is never truly ahead of its patients. Still, Quesnay's ideas lived on. His disciples took his natural order philosophy and turned it into early economics. He became, in some distant academic sense, the ancestor of capitalism, a strange fate for a man who spent his life measuring a royal pulse in a dying court. If you listen closely, you can almost hear that heartbeat still, steady, elegant, hopeless, echoing through the gilded corridors of Versailles. Each tick of the clock, each flutter of the silk curtain, marking the rhythm of a world that mistook luxury for health and logic for salvation. And so the doctor rests, his charts and theories gathering dust beside the ghosts of powdered nobles. The palace remains, a magnificent autopsy report written in gold. And so we come to the end of our long, feverish bedside visit through history, a quiet procession of doctors and kings, queens and corpses, all stitched together by that strange, delicate thread called healing, or at least the attempt at it. Because when you look back, you start to realize that royal medicine was rarely about medicine at all. It was about theater, reassurance, a ritual to convince the powerful that their bodies were not as mortal as everyone else's. The doctors knew it, the royals knew it, and we, centuries later, can see the irony glowing faintly through the candle smoke. From the alchemists who dosed kings with mercury, to the priests who prescribed prayer and enemas, to the Enlightenment physicians who replaced superstition with self-importance, every royal doctor in history has lived at that odd crossroads between science and spectacle. Dr. Antoine d'Aquin poisoning courtiers in the name of favor, Queen Anne's physicians turning tragedy into paperwork, Rasputin, half mystic, half medical disaster, playing God with a trembling czar, Frederick Trebs dressing exploitation up as compassion, William Gull wandering through conspiracy's fog, and Francois Quesnay charting the royal pulse while the kingdom itself quietly flatlined. Each one believed he was saving someone. Each one left behind someone worse. And yet, there's something strangely human about all of it. These were not villains in white coats. They were men of their time, standing knee-deep in ignorance, armed with herbs, ego, and the occasional good intention. They cut, bled, burned, and purged because that was what care looked like then. And somehow, even now, we still do the same in quieter ways, just with better lighting and more paperwork. History, like medicine, repeats itself politely. So tonight, as the candle burns low, we can close our eyes and imagine that long corridor of physicians through time, each one stepping forward, scalpel in hand, to serve a crown that was always dying of something: hubris, vanity, inheritance, or just history itself. And somewhere in the background, the faintest sound of ink scratching across parchment, another prescription being written, another pulse being taken, another patient being promised immortality by a man who will die first. Because that's how it's always gone, hasn't it? The doctor kneels, the monarch coughs, and the clock keeps ticking, measuring out the small, fragile distance between power and decay. So breathe out, dim the lights. Let the royal patients rest now. Their fevers, their delusions, their immaculate diagnoses. The empire sleeps. The doctors are gone. And history, ever patient, waits quietly for its next appointment.